Hello, it's Dawn Michelle and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought we'd do a fun little sort of retrospective, I guess. I have been redoing my tarot space over the last 2 weeks, and I use the term I very loosely because I've got a bad back right now, so my wonderful husband has been doing the majority of the work. However, we've revamped pretty much everything and it was a whole ordeal. It's still not done at the time I'm filming. It will be done by the end of February, but at the time I'm filming, it's still not done. We're still in the process of finishing up a few things, still waiting for some things to be delivered and things of that nature. So this whole revamping my space also meant that I ended up going through all of my decks. Now, I've talked about this quite a bit in recent member videos because I had a whole moment. We won't call it a breakdown because it wasn't an official breakdown, but I had a moment over the sheer amount of decks that I had because we started this whole project with painting, and in order to paint, everything had to come off the shelves and all the bookshelves had to come away from the walls. So I ended up just putting them in a giant pile, and then I was completely overwhelmed. It was a whole thing. We ended up just throwing them in bins and tossing them in the closet, and I attempted to get them back out and go through them, and it was just super overwhelming to try and do them all at once because I do not know how many decks I have anymore. I've lost count. My spreadsheets are a mess. So with this whole process, I have decided that rather than trying to go through all my decks at once, I'm going to allow myself the whole of 2025, if it takes me that long, to go through my entire collection, get it back in line, figure out actually what I have and what I'm using, what I want to keep, maybe what I want to move along. So in thinking about this whole process and beginning this whole process, I went back to the spreadsheet that I do have that is sorely out of date, but at least it's a start. And I was looking back at the very first tarot decks that I purchased. And I have all of my first 5 decks here, and I thought it would be fun to just maybe start this whole process off with just kind of touching base with my first 5. So the first 5 tarot decks. Now I have kept this just to tarot. I may do oracle at some point, but I'm a little less fussy when it comes to the oracle decks, or maybe I'm actually more fussy and more picky, so I don't have as many of those. But I thought it would be fun to just kind of touch base, start with my first 5. Let's see how I feel about all of them, and I'll talk about when I purchased them roughly and, do I still use them? And I just thought it would be fun to begin this process off with my first 5 tarot decks. Now for me, this is going back to 2009. That's when I bought my first tarot deck. Previous of that, I was using other tarot decks as I was, borrowed tarot decks from friends and things like that. I did not have my own until 2009. That was the first time I bought a deck for myself. I can't even remember when I started learning to read tarot. It was sometime in the early 2000s, and I won't go into that whole story here. But at any rate, I thought it would be fun to just kind of touch base with my first 5 decks because a lot of things have shifted in my tarot practice over the last few years, incorporating planning, dice casting, role-playing things into my tarot practice. And I thought it would be really interesting and fun just to kind of touch base with the first 5 tarot decks that I purchased and see how I feel about them today. So let's start with the very first deck I ever purchased, and it's in this beautiful Moonlit Fae bag, which is not where it started. So this was the first deck that I purchased for myself back in 2009. I purchased it from a local metaphysical shop in the town that I was living in at the time. Went shopping with the friend who basically taught me to read tarot, and this was, I think, fairly new out at the time. Anyway, it was the deck that the people at the metaphysical shop recommended to me. I really didn't know much about tarot and the Rider-Waite-Smith at that point because I hadn't been taught to read strictly Rider-Waite-Smith. I had been taught to read, as I've mentioned many times before, this kind of numerological elemental system that allows you to kind of use any of these decks, whether it's RWS, Thoth, Marseille. It's kind of a homebrew style of reading, which I have, changed and adapted over the years to fit my own style. So I think one of the reasons that the metaphysical shop, maybe if I remember correctly, or perhaps it was my friend, I don't remember because it was a very long time ago, 2009. Like, do you remember back when? I think one of the reasons that this deck was recommended to me was because in the guidebook of The Legacy of the Divine, there is interpretations by several different tarot authors. And so you kind of get a little bit of a broader flavor for each of the cards. We, of course, have, this is a Ciro Marchetti deck. We do have Ciro's interpretations in there as well. And I can't remember who the other tarot readers were that their interpretations were included. But it was a nice one to get familiar with the RWS system. This was the first time that I had really studied and began to understand that there was a system developed by Waite and, of course, illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith. And this was the first time that I really got to know that that was a thing and used the guidebook to kind of help me learn, along with some other, quintessential references like 78 Degrees of Wisdom. That was my tarot Bible for a very long time, as I was trying to find my way with this whole Rider-Waite-Smith system and the particular way that these cards were interpreted. The artwork itself really doesn't do a whole lot for me. I do like that it was very fantasy based. I mean, I've always been a fantasy girly. Always been a fangirl type of girl. And so this kind of artwork did appeal to me in that sense because it does feel very fantasy. This is still one of my favorite Eight of Swords cards. I absolutely love it. I think it is absolutely beautiful. Funny story, I got to meet Ciro Marchetti at the StarCon conference that we went to in Florida, and I mentioned that this was my first deck, and he really turned his nose up at it and was not very pleased to hear that this was my first deck, but we had a funny little conversation about it and it was really cool. This was my very first deck. I still have it. I do not read with this one at all. This is I totally keep it for sentimental reasons because it was the first, right? It was the first deck I ever purchased for myself. While it wasn't necessarily a deck that I felt particularly called to, it was the one that was recommended to me, and it is the one that I kind of cut my teeth on learning the RWS system with. So I'll probably always keep it just because it has a special place in my heart for that reason. However, I haven't read with it in I don't know how many years. So following my whole Legacy of the Divine experience, in 2009, I discovered that there were tarot decks on Amazon. This deck is still in this wonky bag that I crocheted for it. I don't even know how many years ago, probably since 2009. It's holding up fairly well considering what I put it through. And this is the Fenestra Tarot. Here's the backs. I was on a hunt at the time when I discovered that tarot decks were on Amazon oh so long ago, back in 2009. I was on the hunt for something a bit more feminine in terms of a tarot deck. I don't think there were a ton of decks online at that time. I don't think there were a ton of decks available at that time, but I wanted something very feminine, and in the small selection that I found, this was one of the decks that popped to the forefront because the Legacy of the Divine, being the only tarot deck that I had for most of that year, I do feel like I bought this one maybe towards the end of 2009. It had a bit of a masculine feel to it, and I wanted something that felt a bit more feminine, a bit softer, something that maybe read a bit softer, again, still sticking in that Rider-Waite-Smith area. And to be honest, I think most of the tarot decks at that time were Rider-Waite-Smith based. There were a few Thoth ones, obviously the OG Thoth, but for the most part, I think what I came across was actually RWS inspired decks. This is probably considered a clone. I don't know that I necessarily know exactly what determines what is a clone and what isn't. I feel like it's very subjective. I would consider this just an RWS inspired deck. It's not 100% a copy of Pixie's artwork, so I don't personally consider it a clone, but it does follow the system very closely. This is a deck that I really did enjoy working with for some time. Again, it stuck with the system that I was trying to learn at the time and trying to get familiar with, trying to wrap my brain around how I could make that system work with the way that I was taught to read tarot. But again, I wanted something just a little bit softer, a little bit more feminine, a little bit more, I would say me, but this isn't me either. So the first two decks that I bought really weren't me at all. I do think it's a beautiful deck. Again, it's one I kind of keep for sentimental value. I do read with it on occasion. I did a lot of work with this deck. I did a lot of, personal readings, relationship readings, or interpersonal readings. That was primarily what I ended up using this deck for. And it's kind of funny how, thinking back, even going back to 2009, even as I was very slowly starting to build my collection, decks were already finding their place. So I was using the Legacy of the Divine primarily for personal readings. What do I need to know about me and my personal growth and all of that? Skip that Queen of Pentacles, put her on top. And this one I use primarily for relationship readings. So readings around, my personal relationships, my marriage, my kids. Had very young kids at that point. My youngest would have only been 1 at the time I purchased this deck. And, friends and family and whatnot. And so it was a beautiful one for that. I really enjoyed working with it. I do still occasionally get into it, but when I do, it's really just for kind of that nostalgia's sake, not necessarily because it really has a particular purpose in my collection anymore. It's more of just like my OG relationship deck, so I hang on to it. So the next deck that I purchased, which did live in its original box, clear up until I do believe last year, which is pretty good. This is the Housewives Tarot, and I bought this one back in 2010. So this was a deck that, again, just finding fun decks on Amazon. I came across this one. It comes in the big recipe box, and that was just a novelty thing for me at the time. I do actually really love this deck. I am a huge fan of 50s sitcoms. I don't know if that's a thing that's widely known about me. I know it's weird when you think about my whole D&D sci-fi love affair that I have going on, but I do love me some 50s sitcoms. I'm a huge I Love Lucy fan, and I grew up watching that, and this deck just kind of reminded me that was a huge actual part of my childhood. I don't know if y'all remember, those who are as old as I am might, but back in the day, there used to be a thing called Nick at Night, and it was Nickelodeon had a separate channel that showed old TV shows. And back then, it showed TV shows from the 50s. So when I would go to bed at night, whatever, as a kid into my teenage years, I would watch Nick at Night before I went to bed. And I remember it being shows like I Love Lucy, Donna Reed, The Patty Duke Show, things of that nature. And I kind of loved it. And this deck really kind of just represented that. So in a weird way, this deck kind of represents my childhood, but just because these types of shows were always on in my house. It was either I Love Lucy or Star Trek. So thus the two sides of my personality, I suppose. So using this deck now, and I do still use this deck. This is one that is active in my collection. This deck has the best, cheekiest energy. I absolutely love pairing it with the Zombie Tarot that also has a similar energy. And I think last year I played pairing it with the Zombie Tarot and the Curious Creatures. I think I have a video on that. If you haven't seen it, check it out, because those three together are just kind of an amazing little fun pairing, or trio, I guess, as the case may be. I really love this deck. It's got this Devil card is amazing. Just love it. It's got an amazing, fun energy to it. I really get great readings. They're very succinct, but they also have kind of this dude, stop taking yourself so seriously edge to it, the same way that the zombies do. But this one has just a little bit of a more personal connection to me, being that it does look like it's out of these, 50 sitcoms that I loved growing up and still do watch to this day. I mean, I was just watching I Love Lucy the other day. So this is one that definitely is still in my collection, still hanging out in my collection, not going anywhere. It's still an active deck that I work with and read with. And I love it. It's one that I tend to pull out whenever I'm just feeling like I need this kind of energy. I do have other decks, and I've brought other decks into my collection that kind of sit in the same space, thinking of things like the Pulp Tarot. And those don't usually stick around very long because I have had this one since 2010. So I'm very bonded to this one. This is one of the first decks that actually felt like it kind of related to my life in a very personal way. And so it's definitely one that I will be hanging on to forever and ever, but it is still one that I work with and actively read with because I just absolutely love it. I'm bonded to it. I have a personal connection to it, and it just works great for me. So let's talk about the third deck I ever purchased, which is really, I think, the first deck that I ever really felt a very strong personal connection to. And this is my absolutely beloved Steampunk Tarot. I've shown this deck in many, many videos. It is very well worn. It is incredibly bowed because I have used the heck out of this deck since 2014. That's when I purchased it. I love it. This deck is the first deck that I feel like I really found a deck that represented me, that clicked for me on a personal level. You know, the Fenestra was great for relationships readings, but it didn't really feel like me. The Legacy of the Divine, I used it for a deck for me for personal readings, but it never really felt super personal and super connected to it. The Housewives was fun, but that really related more back to my childhood and a very particular kind of cheeky fun energy. Whereas this was the first deck that I felt like I could make a connection to, or really that I did make a personal connection to, because it represented a world and an energy that I related to. I love the steampunk vibe. I particularly loved it at that time of my life. I think at that time I was also exploring Wicca. I don't know why those two things are connected in my brain, but they are. Again, probably just a time and a place thing. But this felt like a world that I could find myself in, a world that I could connect to. I understood what it was telling me. I understood the cards. I got the artwork. The messages came through in a very clear and succinct way. This was the deck that I used exclusively for the next few years, at least 2 or 3, I think, because I didn't really bring any other decks into my collection for another couple years. I had this one, I was good, I read with it, I used it. Now back then my tarot practice didn't look anything like it does now. It was very chaotic. I had young kids. I kind of did readings whenever I could. It was spur of the moment, sneak in a reading here and there, and it wasn't really an intentional thing that I did. So the fact that I only had a handful of decks really didn't matter that much because I didn't read tarot that often. I read when I could, but I just didn't have the time. Again, little kids, very active family, and there was just a lot going on. So I love this deck. I use this deck. It's one that I still pull out to use. It's one of my favorite decks to pull out in the autumn. It really feels like it has that energy. It's dark, it's moody, but again, it's such an easy reader for me that I just, oh look, there's our Queen of Pentacles. I just feel like this deck gets me and I get it in a way that similarly the Dreaming Way works for me now. Funny enough, that was the 6th deck I bought. I didn't pull it out because I'm only doing my first 5, but the 6th deck I bought was the Dreaming Way. So yeah, the Steampunk Tarot is definitely one that is staying in my collection forever. I do still read with it. I do still love it. It still works wonderfully for me. So the last deck in my first 5 is the Wild Unknown Tarot. Now this deck I have been on a journey with because I got it in 2016 when it came out mass market, I do believe. And it was available indie before that, but I didn't really know that indie decks were a thing, nor did I know how to get them. So it was when I saw this one come out mass market. This was, I think, about the time I started finding TarotTube as well. And I started watching videos and walkthroughs and, heard about this deck. And I was really, really intrigued by the artwork. And on the surface, this deck should have worked for me out of the box. It did not. I really, really struggled with it. I really thought it would because it doesn't necessarily sit fully in the Rider-Waite-Smith. I mean, if you read the guidebook, the creator kind of tries to tie it back in, but it really doesn't that well, in my opinion. It's a deck that kind of goes its own way, and I feel like this really, it was all over the place for the longest time, and to the point where I felt like it was just oversaturation. All I was seeing was the Wild Unknown. And I'll be honest, that probably kind of turned me off because I just got tired of seeing it everywhere. And it wasn't really clicking for me. I think I even made a video way back in the day talking about this was a deck that I wanted to love but just couldn't. For whatever reason, it just didn't connect for me. And I ended up putting it away. I didn't get rid of it. This is the original copy that I bought back in 2016. I have since bought every other Wild Unknown deck that is available in every size available. So clearly, I found my way with this deck. And I think it's really just kind of one of those time and place things where I had to just kind of come back to it when I was ready for it. I think it was a couple of years ago. I was like, let me just try this because I still have it. I think I was trying to justify still having it in my collection at the time. And so I pulled it out and I started working with it. And then just for whatever reason, like it finally clicked. I finally got it. I was able to work with it. I do really love the artwork. Like this art style is totally my jam. I really struggled, I think, with the animals because I'm not really big on working with animal energy. I work with it a little bit in the context of my artwork and tarot, but I'm not really well versed in what animal energy means. And so like the bat for the hanged man, I can totally get, but did we have a court card? Okay, so like this bird swan thing here, like can't even tell you what it is for the Father of Cups. Like that really missed the mark for me. And I think that maybe, like looking back now, is maybe what the issue was. It was the animals in this deck. And there are quite a few of them. The trees I'm fine with. The majors, even to some extent, I'm fine with. Like this bird for death, totally get that. But here we are again back to a bird, a swan, whatever that is for the Daughter of Cups. And again, animals. This works great for me. This is a pip card. I can work with this in a way that is in alignment with the way that I read tarot numerologically and elementally. So that was great. Even something like this is wonderful. No problem with the giant tree for the Emperor. I mean, it was great. These, fantastic. I think it was really those court cards, those animal court cards, I think that were what really turned me off of this deck. And I just couldn't wrap my brain around it because there's nothing else to work with if I can find one. It's just the animal, right? And the whatever the suit element is or suit emblem is. And so I had a really hard time with that to begin with. And I think that I just had to kind of find my way with it and be able to work with it in a way that works for me. I kind of discount the animal, if I'm being perfectly honest. I really don't look at like what that animal means. I just look at kind of Mother of Swords. I look at that air energy, that wise woman that's speaking the truth. That's the kind of energy that comes through. And yes, all of that can be attributed to this owl, but I don't know anything about owls really, so I couldn't even tell you if that's right. I think it probably is. And some of them, like, I didn't struggle with, and some of them I totally did. But I think it was the court cards that really tripped me up the first time. And I just kind of, like, threw out the whole trying to work with the animal energy within the courts and just did my own thing with it. And then it totally connected, and it works great. And I really do love this whole series of decks. Like I said, I have them all the different versions of the tarot. I have all the different versions of the oracles. I guess I don't have an indie edition of the Wild Unknown. That would be the only one I'm like missing in my little like Wild Unknown collection, but I have the archetypes and the alchemy and the animal one, and I've got them in mass market, and I do have the animal one in indie as well, and then all the little pockets that they've come out with so far, which are amazing. So I definitely really enjoy this deck. I found my way with it, but I feel like back in the day, it wasn't the time and place for it. I just wasn't ready. I was still trying to, I think, wrap my brain around working with very heavy Rider-Waite-Smith decks and trying to still incorporate that into the way that I read tarot. And this, like, while it should have worked out of the box, because it really allowed me to step back into that, I think I was so focused on trying to learn the other way of reading that I just couldn't incorporate this back in until I kind of finished that study in a way. I'm never really finished with it, but until I kind of finished that and was able to kind of reorient myself and bring myself back to kind of my base practice and, you know, just letting things be influenced by the art that I'm seeing. And it works great now. So definitely one that I'm keeping, still using, and is still active in my collection. So there we go. A look at my first 5 tarot decks that I ever purchased, starting with the Legacy of the Divine in 2009, the Fenestra in 2009, the Housewives Tarot in 2010, the Steampunk Tarot in 2014, and the Wild Unknown in 2016. And again, giving an honorable mention to the Dreaming Way Tarot, because I bought my first copy of that in 2017 and I have loved it ever since. But that is technically deck number 6, so we're not going to cheat, even though I mentioned it. It's totally cheating. But I didn't show it, so it doesn't count. So anyway, that's the first 5 decks that I ever bought. Definitely keeping them all, some of them for nostalgia reasons, others because I still actively use them and work with them in my collection. I would love to know what your first 5 tarot decks were. So definitely let me know in the comments below if you want to make a VR or whatever. That'd be awesome. I always love seeing what everybody like started their collection with. For me, this was the beginning, and we shall see how my collection evolves over 2025 as I work to kind of get things back in order. Again, trying to find some focus this year, trying to really figure out where my tarot practice is headed from here. It's changed quite a bit over the last few years, which I'm totally on board for. Change is growth, that is good. But I'm kind of curious to see where I'll end up at the end of the year as I'm starting the year out here trying to get myself back in order. I will be going through my collection and doing all of that in my member space, so if you want to come hang out with me for some lives and just talking about the decks that I've got in my collection and what I'm going to be doing with them, definitely check that out. There's a link for that in the description box below, along with links for everything that I've shown here. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.